I'm Mohamed Alavi. I'm a senior researcher lecturer in University of Freiburg in Switzerland. I'm also a visiting researcher now in University College London. So this is, of course, a collaborative work. My co-authors are Himanshu, Verma, Jakub, Mlynar, and Denis Lalanne. Himanshu is here, and Jakub is hopefully watching us live. The project that I'm presenting is a part of a series of our engagement and collaboration in a bigger project in Switzerland called the Smart Living Lab. And what you will see here, and also like in the paper, is a sort of our attempt to explore how HCI can engage in sustainable architecture project. So the paper itself starts with sort of wider view explaining why the engagement of HCI in steering the future of our interactive experiences with and within built environments is increasingly crucial. This is sort of the concept that we try to capture with the new notion of human-building interaction. And then the main part of the paper then narrows down the discussion and gives a structured, basically, narration of one specific project that we did with architects. And then at the end of the paper, we try to open up the discussion again and try to see what we learned in this specific project, how much of it is basically generalizable and can be recommended as replicable practices for design of offices. Another point that I want to mention here is that what this paper presents is the second phase of a 3-year-long study. The first phase of this study was published in CHI 2017 with the same group of authors, with Himanshu here. So to give you a bit of context, I would like to introduce actually the Smart Living Lab project, which is basically a research facility that we use to basically build up understanding of relations between building and its occupants. This is the current building where we run most of our studies. It's basically composed of reusable wooden boxes, because the idea was that this is only the first version of the building. In the next cycles of the building, these boxes will be reused in sort of completely different architectural shape and design. Where we are quite actually in the center of Switzerland, in the city of Freiburg, not far from where the Gruyere cheese is made, the village of Gruyere. So if you would like to visit us, that's where we are. So the HCI team that we have in this Smart Living Lab project sort of lead a series of projects. My colleagues work on persuasive design to change energy use behavior. That is one theme of project that we do there. And then we have several projects around the concept of comfort, because in our perspective, comfort is not only a quality of building, it's also an interactive experience. And it basically opens up many interesting research questions in HCI community, as we have seen some of these research questions basically being addressed in CHI this year and previous years, questions related to a control and agency of architectural elements, for example. Then we have this project that I'll be presenting in a bit, with sort of broad objective of studying space use behavior and perception of spatial design. And then in a sort of broader and more abstract level, the other product of collaborating with architects has been basically the capturing of reflections and ideas about the role of HCI in shaping the future of built environments. And in CHI 2016, we started actually discussing possible mutual learning of HCI interaction design and architecture, with this notion of human building interaction, and it evolved into some framing publications. Now we have a 2CHI special issue on human building interaction. If you're interested in the topic, the papers will be out next year. So going back to spatial sustainability problem, optimized use of space is not an original or even recent problem in architecture. So space is a rare resource, and it takes a lot of material and energy to build it and to maintain it. What we tried to do was to basically examine the methods of user research to approach the problem of space optimization. So as I mentioned before, the project was done in 2 phases and in collaboration with our colleagues from the domains of building performance engineering, a team of interior architects, and social scientists. So the first phase of the project, as I said, was published in 2017, but just to give you a very brief outline of that work, we used Bluetooth bracelets to record the movements of building users between different areas, offices, cafeteria, meeting rooms, atrium. And then from the data, we could extract patterns of space use behavior. And to some extent, they correlated with the professional profile of the space users. For example, if you are a project manager, you would have a different space use pattern than if you are an engineer or researcher. But the sort of shaking or shocking result that we got was the very low occupancy rate of the building, which motivated a practical and radical move to the second phase of the project. So this is actually the main topic of this paper that I'm presenting. So we started by considering different ways of intensification of space use, one famous or infamous of which is hot desking. So we knew that hot desking could actually cause the feeling of detachment to workplace, discomfort, or even other negative impacts on productivity and satisfaction. So we suggested, first of all, having a session with the future users of the space that we are going to redesign. We made a co-design session. We asked the staff of 4 research labs, whose offices are actually in the Smart Living Lab, to participate in a co-design session, which took almost, I guess, the whole afternoon. So it started with us giving sort of explanation about the goal of the session, and then it continued with group discussion and sketching of what they thought could be sort of perfect or ideal future office spaces for them. From the audio record and sketches produced by the participant, we identified 2 main concerns. One of them is privacy, or particularly visual privacy, and then the second one, collaboration. So when we asked about the main motivation of participants to be present in the office, they mentioned interaction with the other members of their lab. So we took these 2 concerns and also many other detailed suggestions, for example, personal storage and so on, and then we tried to match them with practical possibilities in terms of budget, timing, and spatial resources that we had. And then at the end, the decision was to refurbish 2 shared spaces that you see in blue there. Each room is 14 by 9 meters, and these 2 rooms would be used by 4 research teams, which had been using, at that time, 4 separate shared offices. In a sort of conceptual level, then the stakeholders decided to make one of these rooms in a way that it would afford collaboration, interactivity, and sense of sharing, and then the other one more private and affording for individual and focused work. Then we had to basically implement those concepts, but this was not our role. We gave it actually to a professional interior design studio, Atelier Oy. We rather made sure that the concerns or the expectations that we saw during the co-design session sort of are conveyed and considered through the processes of solution seeking and decision making. After several rounds of proposition, discussion, communication, all agreed on these 2, sorry it's not very visible, 2 layouts, and over a weekend they became like this. So as you see on your right, the room sort of gives a more sort of open and connective impression compared to the one on the left that is more sort of protected or individual. And for the sake of having a reference, I'm going to call the right one Connective Room and the left one the Calm Room. So Connective Room, Calm Room. 2 technical setups we used to collect space use data with Bluetooth bracelets. Like the first phase, we extracted in which areas in the building each of the participants are, and then with motion trackers, we could record the exact location of participants, but only in the 2 refurbished rooms, not in the whole building. We did observation of 33 participants over almost 2 months, and then we observed these the 2 refurbished rooms and 10 other areas in the building, meeting rooms, other offices. So the analysis that we actually offer in the paper covers 3 scales. First, at the scale of the building, we analyze the navigation between areas in the building. This is based on the Bluetooth bracelet data. And then in the second part, we try to discuss what we observe differently in these 2 refurbished rooms. And then the main focus of the analysis goes inside these 2 refurbished rooms. We try to evaluate the layout design in relation to the recorded user behavior. This is what I'm going to focus on here now. So looking at the motion capture data, the first thing that we did, we tried to basically visualize the data to be able to explore it. We made heat map, and then we also developed tools, animation tools, using which we could basically animate the data in a sort of similar way that typically eye tracking data is animated, right? And then what became really immediately apparent was a sort of unbalanced popularity of workspaces. Some were used all the time and some almost never. And this was not due to particular people liking or disliking certain workspaces. We observed sort of a general preference towards some of the workspaces. So we tried to see why that happened. So we started sharing our data with the social scientists who also observed this experimentation. So one of the hypotheses from the beginning was that the participants tried to avoid workspaces where their screen would be exposed to the others. So to be able to test that, we basically defined this variable visual exposure as the volume of the area behind the workspace from which it would be visible. And then the assumption is that visual exposure can influence the perception of visual privacy. Then in the same line, we define visual openness, which is basically the area that is visible from the workspace, and that relates to visual integration or visual awareness. So then we try to basically compute visual openness and visual exposure through basically, well, we started by making the 3D model of these 2 rooms, and then we used 3D isovist and computed visual exposure and visual openness for each of the workspaces. And then basically the task boiled down to answering 2 questions. One is that did visual exposure have an impact on the occupant's choice of workspace? And then similar question about visual openness. Then to answer this question, we use a combination of inferential statistics and visualization. Let me see if I can, it's not so, it's quite simple actually, but let me see if I can explain it in 30 seconds. So we first, for each of the workspaces in each of these 2 refurbished rooms, we looked at the average time that they were available or not used. And then we made a matrix, like the one that you see, for example, top right there, that compares the availability of every pair of seats or workspaces. The more intense the blue, the higher the difference between the average availability of those 2 compared seats. And then in these matrices that you see here, the seats are randomly sorted. Then we try to change the ordering of the seats. So for example, there you see that the seats are sorted by visual exposure, and then you see sort of a pattern appeared on the top left of the matrix, basically the accumulation of all the blue cells there, suggesting that sorting the workspaces with visual exposure could basically sort them by availability or let's say popularity too. And then it suggests somehow that sort of positive answer to the first question that we had, right? But only for the calm room. So it means that yes, visual exposure seems that had impact on the choice of workspace, but only in the calm room. We did not find that same result in the connective room. But what we found, sort of similar pattern when we sorted with visual openness. So positive answer to the second question, but only for the connective room. So what does this all mean? Well, the result led to at least two types of interpretation. First, in terms of evaluation of the architectural design. Well, it somehow confirmed that the architects achieved their design goals. The participants who were looking for visual privacy appeared to be using mostly the calm room, and when social awareness or integration was at stake, then the participants preferred the connective room. In terms of sustainability, well, it seems that many of the workspaces still were avoided, indicating room for improvement in terms of spatial sustainability, and also more importantly, the understanding of why they were avoided could shed light on the past to rectify the problem. And this is what we discussed in the last section of the paper. And I would like to actually conclude this talk by mentioning part of that discussion that is structured around the idea of zone of maximal spatial quality. So, zone of maximal spatial quality, I'm finishing now very soon, appeared when we plotted all of the workspaces along the two axes of visual exposure and visual openness. The red dots are the workspaces in the calm room, and the blue rectangles are the seats in the connective room. The higher the popularity of workspace, the more intense the color of the icon. And then as you see at the extreme end of each dimension, you find these zones, and then we call them zone of maximal spatial quality. And referring to the layout, we argued that these zones create sort of a gravital force or a self-feeding loop that first shapes strongly the perception of the office, then consequently change the dominant use of the behavior. Then how this can practically help is that first, by having such positioning in the chart, the architects would be able to spot the spaces that are not going to be used, and then looking at these forces and zones, they could basically expect in which directions the other seats should be redesigned. So with that, I apologize that could not go through too many actually important details of this work, and I recommend looking at the paper and happy to take questions. Sorry.
Hi, thank you for the really interesting talk. Samantha Finnegan, Newcastle University. So you talked a lot about how this can be useful for architects in designing buildings, and I really see the potential and the use there for these kind of techniques. Do you foresee any usage for, I mean, obviously buildings carry on being developed over their lifetime, and they change and they evolve. Do you see any usage of these or potential in these techniques for use by people other than architects, for example, building managers or organizations in, continuing to develop buildings?
Yeah, basically giving information is invitation, right? So yes, by making visible this kind of information, you invite changes and modifications. And then depending on what kind of data you can basically present then and in what context, of course you can have that. So in one of the projects, we are trying to basically show the users of workshops how they use different spaces in an open space, and then basically from that they themselves try to think about basically what are the more efficient ways of space and the equipments that they have in that space. So yes, the answer.
So I see that people are vying for coffee, so let's thank the speaker now, and then the remaining questions offline. Thank you. And all of the speakers.